For the second time, Dudley Simpson uses pipe organ to represent the Doctor's people. See episode 19. Unlike episode 29's Sutek Descends, which was deliberately raw and otherworldly, the organ music of the Panopticon reflects the refined civilization of the Time Lords and the stately events it accompanies. Until the end, of course. Much of the music contains harbingers of the drama to unfold, a darkness that overshadows what light there is. In fact, some might know that there's far more organ music in parts 1 and 2 of The Deadly Assassin than I perform here. Quite a lot of it is unobtrusive, meditative, and may even be somewhat improvised. Its character is largely time-filling, a bit of noodling before the bigger stuff. Call it Panopticon Muzak. This is not to belittle this music in any way. Nevertheless, such passages are excluded from my arrangement. The first time the organ music has a prominent place is where, with commentator Runcible below, the cameraman in the gallery is attacked, and we briefly see the attacker, a cowled figure, begin assembling the Staser rifle. With a quick opening flutter, the organ proclaims open fifths on A, bookending two chords made of fourths and fifths. These middle chords are thicker and slightly dissonant compared to the solid enunciations of the A chords. The timbre for the organ's melodic line is in fact the same notes 2 octaves apart. But since it was the right hand's job alone to do this, I thickened up the texture by playing in octaves. Notice also the alternation between legato and staccato in these lines. With the organ timbre of the left hand grounded in root 5th octave, the melody scales its way through the key of B-flat major, supported by the initial B-flat bass. The suggestion of a key is quickly subverted by the bass, snaking upwards and downwards, largely in half steps. So, on the bass note B, we get the major third with neighboring notes above and below. On the bass note C, we get the same note, now the minor third, with neighboring major third. For an interlude of 6 beats, we get a more contemplative, quiet passage that will shortly be developed, featuring very low organ pedal bass notes. More on that anon. This phrase concludes with more neighbor melodies around B-flat over an E bass, the tritone, which resolves back to the open fifths A chord. From here, we get a 3½ measure reiteration of the first phrase, concluding with a similar B-flat neighbor melody. The bass line rises up in steps from E to A, and the hands join in unison to end with a tritone jump to E-flat. When the organ returns, it's in an unbroken sequence of 3 scenes. First, in the gallery, the rifle is assembled and the cowled figure spots the Doctor through its sights. The first half of this scene is supported by the quiet interlude mentioned earlier. The melody is a 1-measure ostinato suggesting D major blurred with D augmented, that is, the neighboring minor 6th. Beneath it, the organ pedals play long, deep notes that slowly rise. Sandwiched between is an arpeggiated counterline that completes the harmony. Although in the program, the organ melody maintains its 2-octave timbre, I wanted this interlude to sound subdued and a bit more like the piano, so the melody is single note, not in octaves. A return to the texture of the first section follows, more octave, scale-wise, and neighbor melodies, with root 5th octave bass. In contrast, however, the bass stretches in rhythm and the melody takes a few breaths instead of a steady stream of 8th notes as before. To end this scene, bass and melody begin to move again, and as the melody repeats a 3-note figure, the bass climbs upwards timorously. We cut to the president and gold usher in the lift as they ascend to the Panopticon. The music is suddenly very quiet, but soon crescendos. There's also a sudden change to triplet rhythms. There are 5 two-measure phrases. Each in turn rises in pitch and dynamics. The first 2 phrases are based on the octatonic scale on F sharp or G flat. The second 2 on D. The final phrase is very chromatic and seems to be based on a 9-note scale with an augmented coloration reminiscent of the whole tone scale. Each melody is harmonized below in various intervals. By the 4th phrase, the intensity builds with octaves in the right hand, while the bass begins pulsing every 2 beats rather than every 4. The final 2-bar phrase begins to repeat, but after only 1 measure, the texture changes. In fact, in the program, these passages overlap each other, but I separate them in the arrangement. This texture change signals the beginning of the 3rd of the 3 continuous scenes, where we return back to the Panopticon and the incognito doctor, who upon spotting the chancellery guards searching for him, strikes up a conversation with the disdainful Runcible. This is the one example of Panopticon music that I elected to transcribe as a transition between the more dramatic music on either side of it. The melody and bass line double each other almost entirely, and an inner wavering 8th note line is also doubled. In general, this section is in B minor, with moments spent on the subdominant E and the dominant F sharp. This latter is heard most clearly as a middle variation resolves there and leads to a repeat of the initial B minor phrase. In the program, unlike my arrangement, this music continues for some time, underscoring the Doctor and Runcible's conversation. My arrangement cuts directly to the moment where their conversation is interrupted by an organ fanfare. This bright pronouncement is made of root 5th on D, with added 2nd E replacing a possible major or minor 3rd. That's right, a suspended sound, leaving us rapt with anticipation. The brightness is dimmed by a neighbor E flat and a quick move through C dominant 7 and B flat major, then back to D. There's also a juxtaposition of duplet and triplet rhythms. Again, my arrangement cuts from the recorded program here, while the Doctor suffers another precognitive vision, spots the rifle in the gallery, and tears through the crowd to reach it. Runcible, professional that he is, resumes his broadcast despite the disturbance, announcing the arrival of the High Council. As they arrive, another even brighter clarion call sounds, a fuller, richer version of the first fanfare. Its grandeur is reflected in a brief metric modulation from 120 to 90 beats per minute. That is, from 2 beats to 1.5 beats per second. It's much easier to hear than to talk about. However, before the fanfare even completes, the tempo resumes its original 120 beats per minute clip. In this section, I avail myself of the grand piano's sostenuto pedal, unused by me since episode 11. You may remember that the sostenuto pedal allows individual notes to be held, as opposed to the damper pedal where all notes are held. I use this to try to emulate the organ pedal notes, which sound independently from the 2 hands of the organist. It's used 3 times, each time taking advantage of a right hand silence to sneak the pedal in. Following the second fanfare, the mood darkens with long, deep notes underscoring the Doctor's arrival in the gallery. The upper notes in octaves remain on D to start, but the bass is a dissonant C sharp. The upper notes form a pair, both descending a tritone. As we return our gaze to the main floor, the Time Lords draw close and surround the platform. While the C-sharp continues to sound in the organ pedals, the crowd's movements and the subsequent opening of the stair-lined panel is heralded by giant parallel triads in both hands. Though the same harmony, sometimes the hands shift in different directions before reuniting. In the first set of giant triads, the peak, F-sharp major, shifts in half steps down to D-sharp minor rather than major. In the second set, the falling continues from E major down to C major. Throughout, the low C-sharp steadfastly underpins this harmonic kaleidoscope. Now, after a tritone-related G major triad, the C-sharp bass finally moves in contrary motion to D under a dip to F-sharp major. With all these parts vital, I strike a glancing blow at the low bass before the triads, in both hands. One more shift in contrary motion leads to a more hopeful sound of F major over an E flat bass, marking the president and gold usher descending the steps onto the dais. Anchored on F, the chords move in contrary motion to each other to the neighboring E flat major and G minor. While the bass E flat reiterates, middle register chords offer a contrast to the rich two-handed triads. Again, the E flat, which I now respell D sharp in the score, holds fast as we're treated to another set of descending chromatic triads, from G major to E major. They bounce to and from these peaks, and I reassert the bass D sharp between them. After one further set of triads descending from B flat major to G major, the bass and harmony shifts more ominously as we begin to cut more rapidly between the president benignly acknowledging the crowd and the doctor in the gallery picking up the rifle. The bass rises to F with a diminished seventh chord with added ninth above. The chordal melody begins a rapid fluctuation between the neighboring note above in a triplet rhythm. Then, a drop down to B in the bass, the tritone-related F dominant 7 above as the doctor raises the rifle. Returning to a view of the president, we get a double octave E natural with an immediate trill of F added. We cut back to the doctor raising the rifle in alarm as the descending triads return in a long triplet rhythm. Quick cuts between the two characters are marked by rising major triads over the steady E bass. Here, I couldn't use the sostenuto pedal effectively, so because of the big sound, I must play the bass and chords separately. And here I elected to play triads first, adding the bass in the long triplet rhythm just heard. This is not as heard in the program, but made sense in the arrangement to continue that rhythm. The doctor fires. Here, I must digress. When I first transcribed this music, I was disheartened that the Staser rifle sound effect completely obscured the penultimate chord. I mean, it literally starts on the same beat, lasts the length of time of that chord, and by the time it dissipates, we're on to the final chord. What should I do? I was prepared for the sake of the piece to estimate a likely chord using my composerly experience, and in fact I did. Sometime later, a matter of a few days, I realized with relief that the reprise of the scene in part 2 solved my problem. For this reprise contains an extra scene not found in part 1. But since the music is the same length, the Staser effect is roughly 1 second later, and the penultimate chord was clear as could be. Crisis averted. And before you ask, I erased the chord from my handwritten score, and I don't remember what I came up with. The mystery chord turned out to be B flat major over B natural in the bass, a lovely diminished and or octatonic sound. As the president crumples, mortally wounded, the final climactic chord is a combination of E major and E augmented, triumphant yet defeated. Again, I dramatically add the bass notes last in 3 octaves for deadly finality. I think this is my favorite piece thus far. But then, every piece I'm currently working on is my favorite. Thank you so much for watching episode 32, part 2, the deadly conclusion to the Panopticon. Next time, a brand new transcription, and look out for some making of videos on this new piece. Subscribe, like, share, and comment. See you next time.